Reading from an article in the New York Post by Andrea Pizer entitled Far Left Agitprop for Pre-K Tots, What NYC Schools Have Come To. I'm not going to read much of this, but just to give you the gist. In an email, it says, in an email to parents and caregivers on January 16th, teacher Rosie Clark lays out lessons based on the Black Lives Matter Week of Action for a pre-kindergarten class at PS 58, located in the well-regarded District 15 in Carroll Gardens. This from teacher Clark writes, this year, who is white, by the way, this year, the week February 3rd through 7th, we're starting to talk about these ideas now as we approach Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which was January 20th. And as we prepare to go into February, Black History Month. I am lucky enough to work at this wonderful school where we strive to help our students understand the complex world around them and think critically about how they can participate in improving it. One of the ways I do that in my classroom is by exploring the 13 principles of the movement for Black lives. So this is a white preschool teacher who is teaching her preschool students. So preschool, you're talking like 4 years old. Teaching a bunch of 4-year-olds the 13 principles of Black Lives Matter. Because this is what we want our preschool teachers to be doing, right? The author of the article continues, some of the 13 points are unobjectionable, preaching diversity plus acceptance and empathy to children who, the dad argues, naturally love their neighbors. Oh, this, by the way, is coming from a dad who alerted the author of the article to this, that this was going on. Then there's principle 6, transgender affirming. Everybody has the right to choose their own gender by listening to their own heart and mind. Everyone gets to choose if they're a boy or a girl, or both, or neither, or something else. And no one gets to choose for them. Then number 7, queer affirming. The principle here is that everybody has the right to choose who they love and the kind of family they want they want by listening to their own heart and mind. And then there's number 12, black women. The teacher writes, there are some people who think that women are less important than men. We know that all people are important and have the right to be safe and talk about their feelings. Now, who are these people who think that women are less important than men? I don't know, but this is what we're telling preschoolers. Okay. There's more to this article. You can go to nypost.com and read it. It's worth the read. Of course, I'm mainly zeroing in on principle number 6, transgender affirming. Everybody has the right to choose their own gender by listening to their own heart and mind. Everyone gets to choose if they're a boy or a girl or both or neither or something else, and no one gets to choose for them. Now, I talk a lot about how left-wing gender theory is inherently nonsensical and impossible to explain or defend. And I've speculated that most people who believe or who pretend to believe this, who espouse it, don't really believe it. And most of the people who pretend to believe the ones that are espousing it don't themselves actually believe it. And I base this on the fact that 10 years ago, almost nobody thought that a dude could really be a woman magically if he feels like one. Almost nobody thought that 10 years ago. 10 years ago and any time prior, almost nobody was advocating for men to be allowed in the women's locker room or to be allowed on the women's track team and so on. And then almost overnight, there's this shift. And I really doubt that all of these people who had lived their lives up to that point believing that biological sex exists, it seems unlikely to me that they overnight could have really authentically, sincerely changed their minds. So I don't think that really happened. I think that they're pretending. But here's the other part of this. Because the left knows that they can't defend their position. They know that most sane adults don't believe it, never will. They know that if they asked almost any adult whether a dude should be able to play on a girls' basketball team, and if that adult was able to be honest, felt safe and felt that they could answer honestly without facing some sort of repercussion, almost any adult would say, no, they shouldn't be allowed to. And that's why they're focusing on children. Leftists play the long game. They've always played the long game. They've never been overly concerned with a short-term situation, to their credit. They're looking at this from a generational perspective. That's why they win. That's why they've won the culture. Because they're looking generations down the line. And they know that if they can get to the kids, if they can convince the kids, it's not going to matter what you think or what I think. It's irrelevant. Who cares about us? Get to the kids, recruit the kids, brainwash them, and then you have the culture. You have everything. And the good thing for them, for the left-wing brainwashers, is that kids, especially preschool-age kids, can be convinced of literally anything. So I say convince the kids, that's really easy. You know what's involved in convincing a 4-year-old of something? Tell them. Whatever you want to convince them of, tell them, and that's it, they're convinced. That's all you have to do. Because 4-year-olds lack the cognitive tools to discern truth from fiction, plausibility from implausibility, reality from fantasy. They can't do that. All that a child at that age can do is rely on the word of the adults in his life. That's the most rational thing for him to do because he doesn't know anything about the world. And so he's going to rely on the adults around him. He has to do that. Because they're not going to understand the whys of things. The other day I caught my 3-year-old trying to put his finger in a power outlet. And of course I stopped him and I was very stern with him. And I explained to him that he can't touch it because he'll get very, very hurt. But of course he had no idea what I was talking about. Electricity, shock, death, injury. What does any of that mean to a 3-year-old? It doesn't. Doesn't mean anything to him. He has my word, and that has to be enough. And to him, there's no difference between one incomprehensible claim that an adult might make and any other. So if, he'll take my word for it on the outlet thing. If I were to tell him, don't walk on the grass because a dragon will come out of the ground and eat you, he'd believe that too. He'd believe it just like he believed the outlet story. To him, they're exactly the same. He doesn't see a difference. He can't measure plausibility versus implausibility. So, if you get to them, the left knows this, convince them, then it doesn't matter. Then you don't have to define it. You don't have to defend it or define your terms. I'm always talking about, can you define the word woman and how that is a pretty conclusive counter argument to all of this gender madness. And it is. But what the left is saying is, who cares? Yeah, we can't defend it. We don't need to because we're going to get your kids. And here's the other part of this. Many of us, I think, still don't understand this about ourselves. The thing is, when you get to a kid and you tell a kid something, they're going to believe it, but they're going to continue believing it in perpetuity unless you tell them otherwise or unless they're convinced otherwise by other adults. You see? Telling a kid something at that age, it has such a lasting, long-term impact that kids will, all the way into adulthood, could continue believing something that is completely absurd and nonsensical just because they were told it as a kid. Unless somebody else comes back around and can deprogram. But if that deprogramming never happens, they're going to live their whole life believing that. And that's the truth for a lot of us too. That what we're taught as a child, whether true or not, whether defensible or not, whether reasonable or not, whatever you're taught will maintain a very strong hold over you well into adulthood and possibly forever. It is very, very, very hard for an adult to break away from the indoctrination that he experienced as a youth, because that stuff gets seared into the brain. The mind forms around it. And to extricate it is extremely difficult. Point being, tell preschoolers that boys are girls and they'll believe you because you said it. And they lack the capacity to know the difference. And then if you keep telling them, most of them will continue believing it. Just as strongly, at the age of 26 and 36 and 56 as they did when they were 6. Most people go their whole lives basically believing everything they were taught as kids. Most people, with most things. Not all. But if you can convince this young generation of kids, if they can convert them, then the game is over. because indoctrinated at that age, even as adults, it's going to be almost impossible at that point to convince them otherwise. Thank you for tuning in to the Daily Wire, one of the fastest growing conservative outlets in the entire country. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and then subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of our content.